Live from the world headquarters of RT America in our nation's capital, this is the news with Rick Sanchez.
And hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez. I know you have come to depend on us in many ways to try and bring you the news and the context of the coronavirus scare, the oil war, and the economic impact of both. But sometimes when it comes to news, it's not so much about what we report as much as it is about what we sometimes hold back on or sometimes what we don't report. I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. Last night on this show, you may have watched this, right? I had this conversation with a guest. The mortality rate is now something like 1.5%. That's not very high, right? Although it's higher than the flu. What do you say to all the people, I'm sure?
It's actually closer to 3%.
What's that?
Yeah, it's actually closer to 3%, whereas the flu is 0.1%.
So guess what? I checked. She's right. But then I checked to see how the World Health Organization came up with that number. And here's what I learned, and I want to share this with you. As far as the death rate goes, quote, the only number currently known is how many people have died out of those who have been reported, keyword reported, to the WHO, the World Health Organization. That, according to experts, makes the mortality rate naive and misleading. Not my words, their words. So they're only calculating people who they know had the disease. But that leaves out everybody who had it and didn't report it, and those who had it, but their case was so mild, wasn't even detected, but they still had it. Let me break this down for you a different way. So the World Health Organization is suggesting that of the 100 people they know had the coronavirus, 3 will die. So that means the mortality rate is 3%, right? Basic math. But here's the problem. What if there were actually 1,000 people who had the disease? Credible science sources, including the WHO itself, are admitting that the death rate numbers are very preliminary. In other words, they know of 100 who had the coronavirus, but that number could have been 1,000. Who knows? Because there could have been another 900 people who had the disease that didn't get reported. They obviously didn't die. So that would bring the mortality rate to what? 0.3%, which isn't that different from the common cold. So look, I'm not saying it's 3% or it's 4% or it's 5% or it's 0.2. I'm not saying what it is. The point here that I want to share with you tonight is this. Be careful with what you hear being dispensed as fact right now. Much of this information, not that it's done on purpose, but much of this information is still in flux. And until the reporting of the virus improves, especially in countries in the United States, we're just now catching up to where other countries like China have been. Until we do that, we have to be very smart. We have to be very judicious about the information that we receive. All right, that's what we try to do here on the news with Rick Sanchez. Look behind the numbers. Try and give you context, because we believe it's time to do news again. Okay, here we go. The list of the questions we think you'll be asking tomorrow. Is the coronavirus death rate really as high as 3%? Lots of scary stories, but what's really happening inside of Iran? Can the media suddenly cover a story it has generally ignored? Okay, here we go. By the way, we are expecting a comment from the White House during this newscast where the president is going to officially declare that we are in a state of emergency, which actually sounds, by the way, much more important than it is. What that essentially does is it gives communities all over the United States the ability to access emergency federal funds. Now, the president may also comment on the stimulus package that he's working out with Nancy Pelosi in Congress. If that happens, we'll obviously bring it to you. All right, let's get started, though, today with the Global Coronavirus Update Desk. Here's Michelle Greenstein to get us going. Michelle, what do you got?
Well, Rick, let's start in Europe because according to the UN's World Health Organization, Europe is now the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. By the way, today the European Commission, the body that represents the EU, just announced that it's going to relax rules that limit how much of these EU member states can borrow money-wise. Now, here's the first story I have for you today. Spain just declared a state of emergency. It will last 15 days, and like you just said, will give the government wide-ranging powers like the ability to order evacuations and confine people. Now, next up, we have Italy, where the entire country is still under quarantine. In fact, all Catholic churches in Rome have been ordered to close. So think about what that means, right? This is not, Catholic churches in Kentucky. This is Catholic churches in Rome. This is the Vatican. By the way, Italy is testing for COVID-19 pretty aggressively, so this might explain why Italy is seeing way more cases than any other country in Europe of this virus. Also in Europe, we're learning now that the UK is postponing all local and mayoral elections for about a year. But as things start to speed up in Europe, the infection rate in places like China and South Korea and Asian countries is actually slowing down. They're both seeing a decrease in their infection rate. Mainland China only reported 8 new infections yesterday, and South Korea witnessed its lowest number of new cases since February. By the way, South Korea has tested more than 230,000 people for free and has set up drive-through testing, which they say is safer because you're not running the risk of people obtaining this virus at the doctor's office or any other testing facility. So they're kind of being heralded as an example of how to handle this outbreak in the correct way. Now, let's go over to Africa because we rarely hear coronavirus news from them, mainly because so far their rates of infection have actually been low compared to the US, compared to Asia, and of course compared to Europe. Now, 18 African countries as of today have registered cases. So even though they really didn't have any news about the coronavirus until recently, now it seems like that's starting to speed up. In fact, Sudan just reported its first coronavirus death today. Now let's come back to the United States, where cases continue to grow. In fact, the only states that do not have any cases right now are Idaho and West Virginia. The first update I have from you for the U.S. is that those new travel restrictions went into effect today that Trump announced 2 days ago. So no travel from the U.S. to Europe and no travel vice versa. Now, the next update I have for you has to do with where you're from, Rick, Miami. Do you know the mayor of Miami?
Yeah, Francis Suarez. Yeah, I kind of grew up with him. I knew his dad when his dad was the mayor, and then he recently was elected mayor. Why do you ask?
Well, unfortunately, he has just tested positive for COVID-19.
Really?
His office is advising, that's right. So it looks like your friend has come down with this virus, and his office is advising anyone who was close to him for the past few days to self-isolate for 14 days. Now, some big news out of the state of Louisiana. The primary election will be postponed until June. It was supposed to happen at the beginning of April, but the Louisiana Secretary of State says that this is the best move to protect the health and safety of Louisiana voters and voting officials. Now, he's expected to sign an executive order pushing that deadline back this afternoon. Now, let's go over to New Rochelle, New York, which is still under quarantine. New York is going to have its own drive-through testing, just like they have in South Korea. The governor says it can handle up to 200 cases per day and is heralding it as faster, easier, smarter, and safer. And finally, as we close out, before I send it back to you, as we know, Rick, colleges and universities have moved a lot of their classes online, and some are even kicking students off campus. But now all these students are scrambling for housing, for transportation. It's really a mess. Schools like Harvard, like MIT, but one company is making it a little easier. U-Haul is offering 30 days of free storage if you're a college student that's been forced to move out. All you have to do is show your student ID.
Drive-through testing. I hear you say it, but I can't visualize it, and I don't understand it. So maybe on one of these upcoming shows, we'll kind of drill down on that and have one of our reporters kind of break it down for us. Good stuff, Michelle. Thanks so much. Joining us now, Professor Shi Chen. He's a public health policy expert who teaches at Yale University. Thank you, Professor, for being with us.
Glad to be here.
So, you know, it's interesting. I saw a report today from one of the most famous mathematicians out of the London School of Infectious Diseases, and he says the way we're now counting the death toll is bound to be wrong because we're only counting the people, and I mentioned this at the top of my newscast, we're only counting the people we know have it, but there are many more that we don't know have it or had it. Is that true?
Yeah, this is correct. So that's why I always encourage aggressively testing people. Like anyone who wants to be tested should be tested, so they can receive their results about their risk. So without being infecting or spreading the virus to others. So I think in America, many states need to aggressively testing people. Like the states I'm living in, we have a few million population, but so far we tested around like 100. Below 200. So I think this is very important. And without knowing this, it's hard to say how many people being infected, which is the denominator of this calculation. And even if without this number, the infectious status, then we do not know even for people die, whether they die from this. Then we do not know the numerator, so we cannot calculate accurately the case fatality rate.
I'm glad you said that, because it seemed like common sense to me, and that allows us now to report it because someone like yourself is able to explain that. But by the way, you're saying we need to know as many people as we possibly can who have contracted this disease so that we can keep a record of it. But there are people, right, Professor, who we will never know had it. They may not even know they had it because it was such a slight version of the disease, it was almost undetectable. Is that true?
Yeah, there's some people are like without any symptom, like we call it asymptomatic, or with very mild symptoms. So this is very much a binary response for this disease. Some people are without any symptoms, some people with severe symptom. So, but as long as there's any flu-like symptoms, we should get them tested. Because most often, like more than half of them are like with some feeling of symptoms, then they go to the clinics and they find they are positive. So we should encourage aggressively testing those.
Let me ask you a question based on what you just said. If there's somebody out there, let's say a 10-year-old child who isn't probably going to get sick from this disease, because usually older people get sick, but they have just a very mild case of it. Even though they have a mild case, can they still transmit? Are they still carriers, or are they less apt to be carriers? What's the variable there?
Yeah, good question. So the carriers, they can still transmit to others, and others may have develop severe symptoms. So that's why everyone potentially carry this virus can spread to others with very severe consequence. So that's why it's very important to test them. And according to data from China and South Korea, like 5% of all those being positive infected, they need ICU care. So if we look at the ICU capacity in America in different states, so we really want to test them early to flatten the curve in order to avoid a large cohort of people are going to ICU. So that's the key. That's why it's different from the flu. Because in flu, there's no such a large risk of being admitted to ICU.
Professor Chen, it's really great to have you. Thanks for setting us straight on all of this. It's important to give this information to our viewers. Thank you once again.
My pleasure.